Fact of the matter is that, of course, a number of countries do not have the resources, especially when you consider that some of these disasters and crises have a very, very heavy impact on GDP. So they need to be, in many cases, ideally complemented by international assistance, in particular also if you want to build back better, which means nothing else than to ensure that underlying vulnerabilities that led to the crisis before are not going to be recreated in the recovery process. And as international community, we are quite well set up on the humanitarian side, we are quite well set up on the development side, and recovery sits really in between. Humanitarian funds cannot be used for recovery, rightly so. Development funds are often locked up in longer term investments and cannot be freed up. So we really need to find a way to address this issue, and I think there's two very concrete proposals that we can pursue. From the public sector, a recovery facility type of idea that invests in the underpinning recovery capacities to manage it for its full duration, 3, 4, 5 years in some cases. And secondly, of course, to mobilize the private sector as a source or in a partnership in recovery processes, including the insurance sector, of course, in terms of protection mechanisms. I mean, traditionally, of course, the private sector already is very heavily involved. What you find in many countries is that the private sector, just as individuals, just as international cooperation, donate to disaster response and recovery efforts. The challenge is to get them engaged in the long-term process. And here, for example, private-public partnerships to rebuild infrastructure is one model you could pursue in some countries. But there is no easy answer that would apply around the world, because it really depends on the country context, what is the nature of the private sector in that country, and how you can really mobilize them. Let's start with the positive side. The first concern should be, let's identify all the right beneficiaries that have actually been affected. Because more often than fraud, you actually find also people that are left out. Particularly in recurring crises, so very often recurring flood cycles, or for example protected droughts, you see perhaps more fraud than after a sudden onset disaster, where it's quite easy to actually relatively easy, comparatively easy, to establish who the beneficiaries are. I mean, the flip side needs to be that you need a robust beneficiary tracking system, a monitoring capacity to establish who are the ones that rightly deserve support, and how can we monitor to ensure that they actually get it. From our experience, though, more often we leave people out that should get support rather than actually people who take advantage of what might be given. We already see, quote, climate refugees within countries and across borders. And so there are areas that are being abandoned, that are either running out of water because of just, too much drought, or actually coastal zones that are becoming inhabitable. Another example is Bangladesh, where the climate change impact is emerging, but where people constantly move because the river system there is so fast moving each year with the yearly floods that you have invariably. So it's interesting to see how these things develop, and yes, we are starting to bring these climate models at early stages, or predictions rather, into development programs. And we have to do so, because in the case of Bangladesh, predictions are that 30 million people will be displaced. Where do they go? Well, a number of things. One, the momentum created that recovery has been included in the Sendai framework. In the previous Yoga framework, it wasn't there. And that, of course, by itself creates a momentum to work on the practice area. The active sharing among partners of good practices that have emerged over the last 10 years, and also the South-South component. For instance, we brought the Indonesian government to the Philippines in 2013. How did you manage the tsunami? How can we learn with Cyclone Yolanda in the Philippines? And the recognition, therefore, from governments, those that also have struggled managing recovery process because they were not prepared. And nothing gets you focused more than a disaster. So the great thing about the recovery process is it's a fantastic opportunity to start doing things right. The not so great thing is that often we wait for a big disaster before we start doing so. But the financing remains a problem, and that's the really hard one we need to crack in the coming years.